And what is up? We're back, college football, in its third week. We want to review this week's legion of games with you. So let's go ahead and do it. There's been a lot going on today in college football. So let's see if we can go down the list of teams that played, activities that had happened, players who stood out, players who did not stand out, and how the landscape is looking this deep into the season that far or thus far. And to look at it, this week didn't have a whole lot of exciting games, but there were still matchups to be talked about. And if you watched last week when your hero gave you the rundown of week 2 in college football, I talked about how I would rather have a top 5 or even a top 10 when it comes down to preseason prognostications, or if you wanted to have a ranking system that early in the season, limited to 5 teams, maybe even 10 teams, because all of it's irrelevant from there on out, in my opinion. And I believe the teams that are in the top 5 or top 10, they're typically strong enough to hold out and win and continue to show how good or how they are overall by the time it gets serious in October. So I think that would have been a better way. It could possibly be a better way, but as we have it right now, this year, we had a 12-team playoffs away from the 4 teams it had before, where it left out players or left out teams and coaches were upset, schools were upset, and we get it. Now there's 12 teams this time around, and we have primarily 2 conferences that may just dominate the headlines, especially after last week, Notre Dame upset by Northern Illinois, and that kind of threw them out of the mix for right now. We can't say what the future will hold, but Notre Dame not being in a conference, being at somewhat of a deficiency right now anyways, because of not being in a conference, that means they were not eligible for a bye week. Now with 1 loss, something really strong is going to have to happen in their favor for them to still make it into the playoffs. The way things seem, primarily, once again, the SEC and the Big Ten will likely be the predominant teams going into the playoffs. Now, there may be some outliers that end up getting in, but it's safe to say that the national champions of 2024, they're likely to come from the SEC or the Big Ten. That's it. I mean, I don't see anything else. I don't see anything around or any way around it, but that just seems how it's going to end up. But anyways, we can move on. This is week number 3, and we would like to get into some of these games that happened during the third week so far. And it started on Thursday. If you were watching, or if you're a college football fan like myself and others, maybe even somewhat of a diehard. But nevertheless, it all started on Thursday, and we saw, if you did watch, those games that were available. One of the games that was available that ended up being a huge, or a pretty good upset. Let me put it that way. I wouldn't say huge upset because UNLV taking on Kansas, even though Kansas was at home. Well, no one else really thought it was that important of a game. There was under 30,000 people at the game. So I don't know, when I think one of these Las Vegas outlets, publications, when they mentioned how the crowd was loud and they couldn't really hear the signals, I don't know what they were getting that from. Maybe someone pumped in some noise, but either way you look at it, hold on one second. Things are buzzing. I got games going. I got games on. Things happening right now. So I'm just checking it out. Hold on one second. Anyways, yes, this is live, and these are the things that happen live. By the way, if you want to join, make sure you hit the link, because I will put the link in the chat. Let me check right now for people who may want to come in and join the conversation, talk about your team, and, well, we can get on it. This isn't just SEC, Big Ten. This is about all of the college football teams, even if they're not on the radar right now. They aren't considered a popular team right now. This is a college football review. I don't know everything, so I'm not going to act like I do. So I'm looking for you all. to be my eyes for a team that I can't get a hold of, or teams I might not know as much about, way out there in the West. Maybe even a 1AA team, maybe even an NAIA team or Division II team. Either way, we're keeping our eyes on the prize, and this right now is we're talking about what UNLV was able to pull off this past Thursday, beating Kansas in Kansas 23-20. And one of the reasons why I don't think it's a huge upset is because UNLV, they've been looking okay. Not that I've sat and watched all of their games, but you get a chance to see the highlights and a significant amount of highlights these days. And you can get an idea that this isn't your daddy's or granddaddy's UNLV. This is a better UNLV squad. And because of the win at Kansas, they're now 3-0. 3-0. UNLV, the Rebels, because I believe they took the running part out of it because of the PC culture we're in now. But they're just the Rebels, I believe, and they are now 3-0. So that's not something they're used to doing or something they're used to having next to their name, a 3-0 record when it comes down to football. We all know basketball-wise UNLV's legacy. We all know about what Tark had done for UNLV. We do know about that 1990 team, in fact, that won the national championship by 30. But we even know about the team the following year that did not win a championship. And there were star-studded players there returning from the previous year's team as well. But UNLV's football team never really getting the hype because they hadn't deserved the hype. So going back and talking about what UNLV used to be once upon a time when they were 3-0, which they are now. 1984. That's the last time UNLV, their football team, was 3-0 in 1984. We're talking an entire generation ago, UNLV. And believe it or not, I'm hoping what happened back then doesn't happen now. They ended the season 11-2, believe it or not. I think they went to the California Bowl. They played Toledo and won the game, ending the season 11-2. However, in true UNLV fashion, we're talking basketball. We know the shenanigans that had happened there and the battles they had against the NCAA with talk, etc. But in true UNLV fashion, back in 1984, when they did go 11-2, the last time they were 3-0 like they are now, they had those games wiped off from 1983 and 84 because of ineligible players. So let's hope what happened back then doesn't happen to the UNLV team now, and they'll be better off for it, obviously. But just thinking about that, everything attached to Las Vegas. Now we do have the Las Vegas Raiders in football now coming from Oakland. Used to be LA, used to be Oakland before that. Things just happen on their way to Las Vegas. And with the running Rebels being what they are, or now Rebels, they took the running part out. I'm thinking that this UNLV team is a pretty good team for today's standards, especially. But that 3-0 record they have right now is the equivalent of what they had back in 1984 when they were 3-0, ultimately ending up 11-2, having that run off the charts because of an ineligible player. And if just for some fun facts, there were players on that team that had gone into the NFL, players that you really know. And if you're old enough, you may still remember one of those players, Randall Cunningham, who ended up playing for the Philadelphia Eagles, where he really made his name. He eventually had gone to Minnesota, played a phenomenal with Randy Moss and all those guys. I mean, come on, they were a dynamite team when he went there as an older player. But the electric RC, Randall Cunningham, the Uncoller, he was the quarterback at UNLV back in 84. And another player that you might have forgotten about, if you've seen some old commercials, or if you are an old enough head, Ickey Woods, the sensation with the Cincinnati Bengals who brought us the Ickey Shuffle, to the point of fast forwarding several decades later, they made commercials about him doing the Ickey Shuffle in a grocery store. I think he spiked the turkey, but those are the two prominent players who were on that 11-2 UNLV back then running Rebels team. So there you have it. But UNLV wins 23-20, and in front of 21,000 fans, I think, something like that. And they talked about how loud it was. But look at that. UNLV was gashed for 199 yards rushing. So I don't know how long this style of play is going to continue. Eventually, it's a bend but don't break defense, and they were able to do it on the road. But have fun while you can. This is UNLV. This is kind of sort of uncharted territory. At least for the last 40 years, it had been 3-0. So have fun while it happens. I'm interested to see how much further they can go. And they're ultimately going to lose, but I want to see how far they can go, how good they can be up until that loss, and see how they handle the loss when it does happen. It seems inevitable. And just see how the program is. The landscape of college football today has allowed a team like UNLV to play the way they're playing or assemble what they have, and gives them every opportunity to win. And seeing how they beat Houston, heading to Houston, is what really made me realize, okay, this UNLV team, I don't know about special, but for their standards, kind of special, but there's something there with UNLV. And then to see how Houston played hard against Oklahoma in Norman kind of gave me a little bit more of an eye raiser or eyebrow raiser, looking at what UNLV was able to do as they were a dominant team against Houston in Houston. So then we move on. Other games that were played. We're reviewing week 3, which started on Thursday, went until Friday, and now we're here on Saturday. I'm doing this live show. If I keep it up, it might be my last show. But we're doing this live show. Kansas State took on Arizona, and Arizona lost. They came to Kansas State and they lost. And they're both ranked teams, but I'm not going to say they're inconsequential, but relative to what I said earlier in the conversation, where I believe the most teams will come from either the SEC or Big Ten, when it comes down to the 12-team playoffs, they'll put some outlier teams in there. But when it's said and done, the national champion will likely come out of the SEC or the Big Ten. I just think that's just what it's going to be. Yes, there will be more teams with dreams, and it's kind of giving you that vibe of the NCAA men's tournament, but it's not like that. Let's not fool ourselves and act like it's going to be like the men's tournament where there's truly going to be a Cinderella who can come and undress these powerhouse teams, kind of like UCF did a few years ago, beating Auburn, who beat Alabama. So then that gave them the right, in their opinion and in the opinion of others, to claim a portion of the national championship. So that wasn't, I don't think that's going to happen this time around. But between the two teams, 31-7, a dominant performance for Kansas State, which is typically dominant at home. Noah Fafita, this is the quarterback for Arizona, and his key target, they call him T-Mac, Titaroa McMillan. They call him T-Mac, had 138 yards. I think preseason-wise, he's a Biletnikoff. He's going to be a Biletnikoff finalist, so probably definitely a favorite going into this season. And he opened it up with a huge bang against New Mexico when he had his 304 yards on 10 catches, averaging almost 1/3 of a football field with each reception. So he's on Arizona, but it wasn't enough. Noah Fafita, undersized quarterback, and incidentally, just for some transparency, for what it's worth, those two did play in high school together in California, Anaheim, California. Skurtine, I think it is, high school they played, Certified High School they played together. And so they're familiar with one another, and they decided to stay at Arizona. Even when their coach left and went to Washington, they stayed at Arizona, loyal to the school, loyal to one another. And in the beginning of the season, as I've mentioned, T-Mac had 304 yards on 10 catches, 30.4 yards per reception against New Mexico. But it certainly did not happen this time around against Kansas State. Kansas State, Avery Johnson, 156 yards passing, 2 touchdowns. And what did he do? Also ran for 110 yards, Typical Kansas State kind of running. Michael Bishop days from way back. The running quarterback, the effective quarterback, the dual threat that's really a pain in the butt on the college level. And by the way, I'm looking at some of the statistics there, and you see a familiar name if you've been keeping up with college football over the past, year and a half maybe. Dylan Edwards, another native Kansan, but who used to play for Coach Prime as a true freshman last year in Colorado. He came back home, leaving Colorado and Coach Prime and coming to Kansas, a homecoming of sorts. And he, as you may know, with Colorado last year, they could not run the football for the life of them. Whether it was by design so Shador could run more or pass more and look good passing and put up enough stats for the NFL, or whether it was just bad personnel. I think it might have been a combination of both. Dylan Edwards, you could see the ability, but with his small stature, he just couldn't get past. He just couldn't get in. He just couldn't run the ball effectively with any consistency when he had it. And he was a threat, a little undersized, but he was a threat on the field, in the backfield, and catching out of the backfield. Well, this year, he's averaging, even though it's a small sample size because he's not the premier runner on the team at Kansas State, he's still averaging over 10 yards a carry. In fact, almost 11 yards a carry with 10.8 yards on the season. Once again, if you want to come in and join the conversation, and that's what it is, it's a conversation. If you're a college football lover or diehard or just a fan of a particular team, bring it in here. I want to know what you're seeing in your neck of the woods. If we have anything that we can match together, mix and match, what do we have in common in terms of our thoughts on particular teams? Maybe even a team I may not know much about. I want to hear from you. So if you want to come in, the link is in the chat. So if you want to come in, you can cam up or you can just leave a message, answer the question, blah, blah, blah. We'll get down to it. But in the meantime, we'll continue going down the slate of college football that have been played so far this weekend. More games still going on right now. A Colorado game is going on right now. Two teams that aren't ranked, but because of last year's game, and of course, Coach Prime, and of course, Shador Sanders, there is a lot of interest in this game. As inconsequential as it may be, there's a lot of interest in this game, and it's going on right now. And I believe Colorado State is up at the moment, 3-0 against Colorado. Well, this is the beginning of the game anyhow, but I think I'll try to keep up as I'm going along because I don't know how long I'm going to be doing this show today. Not for any particular reason. I mean, if no one wants to come in and join the conversation, hey, what's the use of continuing to talk about things that no one's listening to, or by the time they hear it, it won't be valid anymore. But either way, Iowa played Troy. Why do I even bring this game up? Because Iowa has Cade McNamara, the former Michigan Wolverine quarterback, who I don't think very much of as a talent. I don't know him as a person, but I've seen enough of his play at Michigan, now at Iowa, even when he was injured last season. Fresh start this season, not looking very good. He lost with his team last week against Iowa State. And now this week they play against Troy, a lower tier team, allegedly, when you're talking about the Big Ten. And as I'm telling you how the Big Ten is so powerful, along with the SEC and the likelihood of the national champion coming out of either the Big Ten or the SEC this coming season because of the power of both conferences. Well, he's quarterback in Iowa, and they only win 38-21. And I say only because you would expect more just from their defense. See, if it was 38-7, that's more in line with what you would expect from that kind of defense, which Iowa has. Iowa's defense is unquestionable. They're a dominant defense. They only gave up 24 yards in this game. They sacked the quarterback 4 times. So the defense is doing their job. And I'm wondering if it's just a matter of time before the offense and defense start having their issues in the locker room with chemistry because the offense isn't holding up their end of the bargain. Kind of like in the NFL last year where the New York Jets had this phenomenal defense, but Zach Wilson on the offense stagnated everything and blew every opportunity the defense gave to them. This may be the same case with Iowa. Iowa did lose to Iowa State, but no harm, no foul because it's not a Big Ten loss. But Cade McNamara, still their quarterback, still not very productive as a quarterback. 176 yards passing on the day, 99 yards last week, no touchdowns last week against Iowa State, no touchdowns today against Troy. His last time throwing a touchdown was 3 touchdowns against Illinois State. Now, if that's all he has to bring to the table, there's going to be some dissension on the team, in my opinion, and rightfully so, still in my opinion, but rightfully so. So, yeah, Iowa, Troy State, 21-38. So that's another game. The Big Ten gets their win. Nothing to brag about beating on Troy. And so we move on. And where do we move on to? Oklahoma. Yes, they're winning games. But the problem is they're not winning in spectacular fashion. This is their first year in the SEC, so now they're carrying that SEC banner. They're no longer in the Big 12, just being Oklahoma, hanging on to the tradition of the Sooners, going way back. No, they're in the SEC, and they need to put forward their best foot, just like Texas, who so far is holding their end of the bargain. Oklahoma, on the other hand, not looking spectacular, but winning. They played Tulane. They win in Norman, 34-19. Things got a little tenuous. Jackson Arnold, 169 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, but 97 yards rushing. So, all right, we can go and say how Dylan Gabriel left Oklahoma. He's now in Washington, or actually he's now in Oregon. My bad. Washington has their own set of problems with Will Rogers coming from Mississippi State. So there's just, it's hard to keep up with these players these days because they mix and match. You can't even get a chance to remember how they were with their old uniforms on because they're now with other teams. But once again, I see some people in the chat, and this is a college review show. If you're interested in coming in, there's a link for you to either leave a comment or you can come in and cam up. Show us who your team is, talk about your team, or talk about what you think about what's going on in college football today. So let me drop the link again, just in case you may have not seen it. So just let us know. Leave a comment if that's what you're going to do. So far, we talked about a few games this week, which started on Thursday with Thursday night college football, went into Friday, and now we're here on Thursday. And I opened it up with a not too surprising a win, probably for people who don't know better. But we're talking about UNLV winning against Kansas in Kansas. So that is the, I guess, big win so far this college football week 3. And I was just talking about Oklahoma having their struggles against Tulane, but still winning. And I do legitimately mean struggles. You know, you can go back to the old Oklahoma days when they were beating Missouri in the old Big 10 or Big 8. 77-0. See, I'm not looking for that necessarily, but I'm looking for something better than 34-19 against Tulane. Although Tulane, they're not slouches. So I'm not going to act like that. It should have just been an absolute blowout like 77-0. But putting a 40 spot and probably giving up around 12 points, 7 points, that might have been more in line with what Oklahoma should be right now. And as it turns out, Oklahoma is still struggling, even though undefeated. So when they get into the heart of that scheduling, especially now being a member of the SEC, things will get interesting. I think Texas is suited for the battle. Right now, as it stands, with Jackson Arnold as the quarterback instead of Dylan, Dylan who's now up there in Washington, I keep saying Washington, Oregon, Dylan Gabriel, who also went from UCF, now he's with Oregon. But anyways, they need to do a better job if they want to be able to compete in the highest levels in the SEC. That's just how it is, because right now the SEC is so top heavy. Moving on to some of these other games that happened today, something that's kind of been thrown out the window, especially with the changes geographically, with Washington now in the Big Ten and Washington State still in the Pac-12 or Pac-2 for right now. I know this week they just added teams for the future, but right now it's still the Pac-2. Washington State and Oregon State representing the Pac-12 or Pac-2. But the Apple Cup, which was a nice rivalry at the end of the year, they play it today. And if nothing else, Washington State gets the upset win, 24-19. And you just wonder, okay, Washington is a year removed from, or not even a year, but a season removed from also ran status. And while being also ran status, they you would expect it to kind of carry over, especially since they lost Michael Penix, but now they have Will Rogers from Mississippi State to transfer. You know, that's what I was expecting, but that's just not what it is. So once again, I'm putting the link out there. If you want to come in, if you want to comment, if you want to leave a message, if you want to cam up, I have someone right now who's there to cam up. So let's bring him in. And if you saw last week, you saw Jermaine. He's back again. College football, week 3. I'm reviewing, seeing what's going on today. I talked about the UNLV game. I'm sure many people are not looking with or listening and waiting with bated breath to hear about what UNLV had done. But I did mention that this UNLV team, 3-0 for the first time since 1984. And you as an old head and me as an old head, we can talk about the two players I mentioned who played on that UNLV team that ended up going 11-2 and going to the California Bowl, beating Toledo. But those wins and the previous season's wins from 1983 were wiped out because of an ineligible player. Those two players, Randall Cunningham and Ickey Woods, played on that team. So I know you heard about those guys. I don't know if you can hear me or not, but you probably heard about those guys. Let me see. Make sure. All right. But anyway, I was talking about those players. Can you hear me? Can you speak? Okay, I can't hear you now, so I don't know what the deal is.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, okay. There you can hear you now. Now, I was just talking about the UNLV win on Friday, and the reasons why we were talking about the UNLV win is because I know people aren't waiting with bated breath to hear about UNLV winning. I'm just talking about the significance of UNLV being 3-0 for the first time since 1984 when they went 11-2, and they went to a bowl game, beat Toledo in the California Bowl. But you know, there's something to be said about what UNLV is doing now and what they and how well they've played even in the early going in the season when they beat Houston. They went to Houston and beat them. That's not typically what you would get from a UNLV squad. They typically lose those kinds of games. So going back to 1984 when they were 11-2, which is the last time they were 3-0, Harvey Hyde was their coach at the time, but they also had two players that the old heads would know about or just college football fans would know about. And in 84, when they were 3-0, they had Ickey Woods and Randall Cunningham on that team. Ickey Woods and Randall Cunningham were on that team, so it's no surprise that they were 11-2. But as I also mentioned, those wins were wiped off the charts. They ended up being 0-13 because of the use of an ineligible player, making them 0-13 for that season and taking away their wins and losses, well, their wins from the 1983 season as well. So that's what I was bringing up, and I wanted to give those two a shout out because they are kind of legendary names, especially Randall Cunningham, and as the affable and venerable Steve Summers in New York, WFAN would call him RC the Uncola, and that's what he was. That's
Let me put on my Steve Summers impersonation here. Snoozing with the snoozer.
Yeah, snoozing with the snoozer. But he would call Randall Cunningham.
You think we're talking about it?
He would call Randall Cunningham RC the Uncola. So he would use his initials. So, you know, that's just his way of mocking him because of the New York and
Yeah,
Philadelphia,
yeah.
that mattered
Well,
back then.
I didn't see much college football there. I just came home now, turn on Dion against Colorado State over here. Man. Just
Yeah.
put
And what is the score in that game? Because I know it was 3-0 the
three to
last time.
nothing, Colorado State. 3-0.
3-0, right?
Mm.
Yeah, because I actually picked Colorado State to win this game. And I know tribals and haters out there, or people who just can't understand why you would pick one team over the other. They may think you just are just doing, or I'm just doing it because Deion Sanders, there's some dislike for Coach Prime, where there's no dislike for Coach Prime. I think he's freaking entertaining. I'm just thinking that what's going on at Colorado, man, it's more than just football. There's things going on behind the scenes. I mean, I don't think illegal things, but I'm thinking things that probably aren't conducive to having positive chemistry. You know, you hear stories as soon as someone leaves the program, they're coming out and saying things or insinuating things that may have happened there. And you're looking at video of Warren Sapp filming fights and being the commentator. That's toxic. Come on. And if that's what's going on in that environment, that's what I'm
Yeah.
talking about. So,
Listen, you and Baez, I heard y'all talking Monday about there's no continuity. People walking off before the game ending, and this dude talk about, well, they ain't got nothing to do with me. Huh? Just turning Paul Feinbaum on ESPN said this the other day. Like, you wouldn't be surprised if Dion just parachutes out of it.
well, you know what? He created this environment of these kinds of players, wholesale bringing, I believe, over 80 players last season, and now this season just over 50 players, I guess, through the transfer portal and other places to bring them in, and that chemistry isn't there. And football, more than any other sport, I believe, just because of the number of people on the field, there has to be continuity. Everyone has to be on the same page, and you certainly need the chemistry to do that and execute it to have a successful season or team, period. And we've seen it last season, how it started and how it ended. Now we're seeing earlier how it may end. And
They
after
just scored a touchdown. Number
who?
10 just scored a touchdown on Colorado.
Okay, I mean, I still pick Colorado State to win the game, but we saw what happened last year as well. This game is in Fort Collins, Colorado State. So maybe that home field advantage, which it does most times in college football, does help out. And maybe, it makes this game as competitive because talent-wise, I still think Colorado has more talent. It's just, once again, coming down to the continuity and the chemistry and just how things work with people being on the same page. But anyway, that game's going on. I was mentioning about the Kansas State-Arizona game and how Arizona was welcomed to the Big 12 coming from the Pac-12 themselves, losing 31-7, and how Avery Johnson, the quarterback for Kansas State, just had a pretty damn good day. A typical quarterback from Kansas State, rushing the ball, throwing the ball, 156 yards, passing 2 touchdowns. He rushed for 110 yards. And then I mentioned former Colorado Buffalo, Dylan Edwards, the running back, diminutive but still effective. What he did at Colorado when he had his opportunities. Now he's at Kansas State, his home state. He's from Kansas, has 6.8 yards a carry this game and averaging over 10 yards a carry, almost 11 for the season. It's a small sample size, but knowing his electric tendencies and how he could really start and go, I'm thinking that can only benefit Kansas State. And also mentioned Tulane and Oklahoma, how Oklahoma, coming from the Big 12, now in the SEC, and how they've struggled. It's relative, but it's still struggling, even though they're undefeated. They took on Tulane in Norman today. They won 34-19 when I think it was expected. Vegas might have had it right as far as it being more competitive than people think. But I'm still thinking of the Oklahoma from the past of beating Missouri 77-0 days. Not exactly blowing Tulane out like that because Tulane is a better team than people who don't know college football would know. But if Oklahoma is looking to make a statement like Texas had made a statement last week against at least a notable team, because I still don't believe that Michigan should have been the number 10 team, but they beat them. So I'm taking the Oklahoma. It's the onus is on them to look good in the SEC and not just be looked at as a choking dog team, which they've been looked at since Big Choke Bob was there, won that one national championship that he probably wouldn't have won otherwise if Miami would have played instead of Florida State going to that championship. But another story, another day. All the games.
My cat trying to get in on that. Get out of here. I'm busy. Daddy busy.
Hey, another one of those games. Speaking of cats, right? Another one of those games I'm talking about that had that aura of late season battle was the Civil War between Oregon and Oregon State. It's usually in November. We're in September. We hadn't got to October yet, and these are the games that we're having, along with Washington State and Washington, the Apple Cup that we got used to seeing going towards Thanksgiving. Oregon State gets blasted, as expected, 49-14, by Oregon, who now is putting up points and yards like they were expected to do, because they didn't look so well or good. Even last week when they took on Boise State, not necessarily dominant like they probably were expected to be as the number 3 team in the country, but they did put up 546 yards in total offense, and Dylan Gabriel didn't really have to do much of anything. 291 yards. I mean, nothing special in college football going against a team like that that's overmatched. So we moved on from there.
Yeah, I just switched to Fox to see the TCU UCF.
Now TCU UCF, I don't have a score in that game. So what's the score in that game?
21-7. 21-7.
TCU's losing or winning?
21 TCU, 7 UCF.
Okay, UCF. You know, I look at KJ Jefferson, the quarterback who came from Arkansas last year. Another one of those quarterbacks that I looked at that wasn't anything special. So I wondered what teams were doing and asking, wanting him to join their team. I don't think he was anything special to where he's going to be the reason that puts you over the top. And it goes back to even DJ that plays for Florida State, and they're losing today against Memphis. And I'm going to talk about that later. And what he had done at Clemson and then didn't do at Oregon State. And now he's at Florida State doing a lot of the same nothing and losing games. And Florida State is 0-3 now for the first time in forever. And it looks like, Mike Norvell won't get fired because of the contract extension. They're not throwing money away at Florida State like Texas A&M was willing to do with Jimbo Fisher, just giving him over $70 million just to not coach our team, do something else. But, so we'll get to that a little bit later. But Oregon.
I asked you last Saturday what the hell's going on with Florida State. I don't know.
Look, Georgia Tech, I don't think Georgia Tech exposed them. Georgia Tech just played better than they did because Florida State isn't that good. I don't think there's much to be exposed when you don't have a lot of great players. You have decent players, but then the key player on your team is your quarterback, who isn't very good. And I know it sounds mean and nasty to say that he's not very good. No, he's practically bad, flat out bad. And we're seeing it every week. And today was no different than what we've seen now the previous 2 games. He's the reason why they're losing, like most quarterbacks would be. But he's the extra reason why they're losing. And Florida State's in trouble right now. Things are looking bad, and it's going to get worse. And I'm getting my ticket to go to Miami to watch Florida State play in Miami to get back from last year when I went out to Tallahassee to watch Florida State win against Miami, and a close game was practically closer than it should have been. But I'll be out there next month in October down in Miami watching Miami certainly get this kind of get back from them. Michigan State. Prairie View also played. Now, I know no one's really caring about what's going on right now with Michigan State and Prairie View, but the reason why I bring it up is because Michigan State was going through so much mess last season. Mel Tucker, the $95 million 10-year contract, pretty much null and void after his off-field incidents with a sexual assault victim. I mean, a lot of nonsense included. There's some litigation going on right now, so it hasn't ended. I don't think it's completely begun, but litigation has begun, but it's going on right now. He's trying to get some of that money, and I don't blame him. There's a lot of money that was lost.
I just switched to ABC, the Georgia and Kentucky game. Just switched to them.
And that's another good game. Georgia and Kentucky. Mm-hmm. It's a good game only because I really want to see how Georgia's going to be in their first true road game. Because the first game,
ABC don't show the score, man. Show the score.
It was in Athens, so Athens is not too far from Atlanta. So that's essentially it wasn't in Athens, it was in Atlanta, which is not too far from Athens. And so that was practically a home game they had against Clemson in the beginning of the season. Now this is a true road game, but at the same time, Kentucky did struggle against South Carolina last week, lost big at home, which is surprising for Mike Stoops' defense. But then we see South Carolina is not as bad as people might have thought. In fact, I think they did even better than they would have done if Spencer Rattler would have stayed. Well, he couldn't stay. He was out of eligibility. But they're playing better now. They did lose to LSU today, and I'll get to that as well. But this is a pretty good South Carolina team to watch when you think about how good LSU is and is supposed to be this season. But going back to that Michigan State game just for a second, playing Prairie View, Southwestern Athletic Conference, the SWAC, well, they win 40-0. And I'm mentioning that only because it was such a mess last season, in the Big Ten in particular, because you talk about Mel Tucker and what had happened at Michigan State, him getting fired, losing that big contract. And then you look at what happened with Northwestern with their off the field and hazing deals going on. So a lot of litigation in the Big Ten. But Jonathan Smith, now the head coach of Michigan State, came from Oregon State. He brought Aiden Childs with him, who was at Oregon State with him at quarterback, and he puts up 363 yards. So, that's, and he did it last week against Oregon. He put up 363 yards last week against Maryland, which was a shootout. But Michigan State, deserve to get some shout out today because they are 3-0. And I don't think they were much of an afterthought. So I don't think people really thought about them being any particular way because of coming off of last season's record. And then we could go a little bit, and I don't think Pittsburgh, another one of those games that should have been a rivalry game at the end of the season. Pittsburgh and West Virginia, the backyard brawl, another fantastic finish, 38-34. Pittsburgh wins at home. And, well, there we have it. I think between the two of them, two teams going nowhere, not fast, but they're just going nowhere. So Pittsburgh, West Virginia, Pittsburgh pulls it off at home, 38-34. I would still like for the backyard brawl to be at the end of the season as it's been in the past. And once again, if anyone comes in and want to talk college football, go ahead and do it. Go hit the link and come in, either comment or just come in and cam up, and you can do that as well.
Well, I'm going to land my plane right there because one of my neighbors invited me to watch a Canelo fight. He just texted me.
Yeah, that Canelo fight. Man, after not giving us what we wanted with the David Benavidez fight, why do I want to watch Canelo until he's giving us a fight that I want to see? I mean, I would stream the fight, get it for free, and still want my money back. Fight a guy like that. And now, come on, boxing is a dangerous sport, but we're still talking about a declining Canelo at this age, and it's just natural decline. Still overwhelmingly better than Berlanga. That's what it is. Now, there could be surprises because anything can happen in boxing, but there's nothing to indicate that Canelo is going to lose this fight. And you know what? There was nothing to indicate Mike Tyson was going to lose to Buster Douglas either until it happened. But I don't think this is one of those historic nights waiting to happen on Mexican Independence Day, which typically I'm watching the fight because they're giving us what we want. Whether it was Floyd Mayweather fighting on Mexican Independence Day or even Canelo, they were giving us what we wanted when that came along, and we're not getting it now. And that's the reason for me not wanting to watch it. So,
I'm going to pivot back to your college football. I'm going to land my plane here, man.
Okay, man. Nice.
Check what you.
I'll check this off. I'll carry the fort until say bye to Jermaine. He'll be saying bye to me soon too. But Notre Dame took on Purdue today as well after what happened last week against Northern Illinois. Notre Dame had to do something, and guess what? They did something. It's an in-state rivalry. Purdue is not a bad team, and Notre Dame did throw 66 points on them, just giving up 7. And they were 58% on third down. When you get a win like that, though, the numbers really don't matter. If you threw up 700 yards, so what? You're supposed to do that in a 66-7 win. If you have if you're 58% from on third down, 7-12 like they were, same thing applies. So and Riley Leonard had 112 yards. So what? That's passing. He wasn't really needed because he also ran for 100 yards himself and got 30 touchdowns in the process. So 100 yards rushing, 3 touchdowns for Riley Leonard as Notre Dame. I don't think it makes up for what happened last week against Northern Illinois, which got Northern Illinois to the top 25 for the first time in a bit. But, Notre Dame, let's see how it happens. If you start treating teams that have names or real respectable names like this, if you're dropping 50 and 60 on them and just giving up single digits or even very low double digits, then you may just start convincing people that the hiccup that happened was an overseeing a team difficulty and not just you just being Notre Dame, which hasn't been what people thought Notre Dame should have been since 1988. Again, If you want to comment in here, make sure you comment. If you want to just hit the cam, you could come up, talk about some college football. Any team you want. It doesn't have to be the SEC. It doesn't have to only be the Big Ten. It could be whatever your favorite team is. You could talk about St. Francis of Pennsylvania, by the way, who had a big win of their own last week. But you can just come in. It's a review of college football week 3, even though there's still college football going on. Some pretty good college football going on. Georgia's playing Kentucky, their first road game, real road game. As we realized in the beginning of the season, they played in Atlanta, which is just miles away from Athens. So that's not necessarily a road game. They played in the Georgia Dome, the Mercedes-Benz Dome, make it against Clemson. So this is their first real road game, but I expect them to still do well against Kentucky based on what happened in Kentucky last week against South Carolina. Not that South Carolina is a bad team. They're proving to be a better team than expected as well. Beamer Ball is doing some things in Columbia. They did lose to LSU today, but LSU is one of those better teams in the SEC. And LSU had to come from behind to win that game, being down by 17. That's a game we can talk about as well. Sticking with the SEC and an ACC-SEC battle, you had Missouri at number 8 taking on Boston College, who is now in the top 25, but it certainly won't be there much longer after what happened today. It wasn't an absolute blowout, but Missouri did beat Boston College, a close game. Brady Cook, steady as usual. He's one of those quarterbacks that may go. He doesn't have the measurables you would believe, but he'll go in like the 4th round, perhaps, something like that, when he has a chance to go into the NFL. And 264 yards and a touchdown. But Missouri, still number 8, still SEC, ACC matchup. The SEC take this one. Thomas Castellanos, who has been a pain in Florida State's butt the past 2 seasons. If you remember last year's game with Boston College and Chestnut Hill, that was a little too close for comfort, and only boneheaded plays and penalties lost it for Boston College. They got that get back in Tallahassee this season, as we know, adding to Florida State's now 0-3 record. As we see, he was 3 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Never good on the road, especially when you're playing a fairly quality team like a Missouri. And that's what we had today. Man, just going and talking about these teams, man. Come in here and help me out. But that does bring me to the South Carolina game. That atmosphere they have in South Carolina is one of the better atmospheres in all of college football. It's underrated as hell because you don't expect that kind of an atmosphere from a team who hasn't won a national championship. The last Heisman Trophy winner they had was George Rogers. The only Heisman Trophy winner they had that I know of, and haven't checked, is George Rogers. But aside from that, they played LSU, a team who I think is a fairly good team. In fact, a pretty good team. I have Garrett Nussmeier as a dark horse Heisman Trophy candidate. So with that being said, and the way he did play, I think it was more a Brian Kelly issue of not letting him throw more often than it was an issue of him not being that good or not being good enough when they played against USC in the beginning of the season. I think Nussmeier is a legitimate quarterback. I think he's one of those guys who will go in the first round of the NFL draft next season. He doesn't have to be the first pick overall. He just has to be one of 32 quarterbacks or one of 32 players taken in the first round of the draft in 2025. That's what he needs. But that game was lost. South Carolina had a 17-point lead. LSU overcame the 17-point lead and won by a field goal because South Carolina missed the field goal to at least tie it up and go into overtime. And as it happened, I think the first field goal was made, but there was a timeout call, so he kicks the ball and still goes through anyway. And then when it really matters, well, it doesn't go through this time, and LSU on the road wins, coming from 17 down. And as I mentioned, Garrett Nussmeier, 285 yards, nothing spectacular, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, but it was consequential. Without those 2 touchdowns, they don't win the game. Pretty obvious in this case. And Lenora Sellers for South Carolina, 88 yards rushing. So his running game is going to be what this South Carolina team is about. And his combination of being able to run as effectively as he has, 8.8 yards a carry, getting those 2 touchdowns as a running quarterback. And then Raheem Sanders, same deal. That's the running back they really want to rely on. A big bruising battering ram, getting 143 yards, 2 touchdowns of his own, averaging a 7.5 yards a carry. When you can do that, I mentioned it last week if you paid attention. 7.5 yards a carry matters in college football. If you average 5 yards a carry in college football, that's but in the NFL, it matters because it's a lot more difficult to get those 5 yards. If you have 5.5 yards in college, that's okay. When you start hitting 6 and 7, there's probably something special about you. So long as you're not in one of these gimmicky offenses, when you can really rely on your real ability, not the gimmicks that come with an offense, like typically the run and shoot that had wide open lanes because they were so busy occupied with receivers or even the quarterback draw. And they just give you the handoff, and that zone blocking scheme was allowing you to get these big yards. Now, there are some players who did well with it, Barry Sanders and the NFL, but in college I'm talking about. When you had players like I mentioned last week, you had a player like Chuck Weatherspoon, who played for that Houston team that ran the run and shoot. Manny has it as a wide receiver, catching 100 passes or more. You had Andre Ware in his Heisman Trophy winning season, passing the ball, putting up astronomical numbers, putting up 98 points against SMU that year, over 1,000 total yards that year. And Chuck Weatherspoon busting it up almost 10 yards a carry for the season. But then the true colors show up when he goes to the NFL and really can't make a team. I think the Philadelphia Eagles picked him up in the 9th round, and he didn't make the team. Pretty simple. And that's back in the day when they did have 12 rounds to go in. So there's that. But anyways, I mentioned those numbers. I mentioned LSU winning the game, coming from behind 36-33 against South Carolina. So there we have it there. And then one of these games I checked out, and one of these games I was interested in, not because I thought there was an upset alert. It's more because, well, it's Alabama. And Alabama going from the deep South SEC up to the Midwest, Wisconsin. We know how that battle can be. We know about those big, huge offensive linemen that typically go to Wisconsin. They love to run the ball. Their quarterback is typically not the guy that spreads out the offense. He's usually the guy who he can run himself. He really manages the game. But with now the transfer portal being what it is, college football being what it is, Wisconsin now has Tyler Van Dyke, former quarterback for the Miami Hurricanes. But he didn't do much of anything because a lot of the reasons why he left Miami for not doing a lot of everything when he did show some promise once upon a time is he is who he is. He does get injured and they have to replace him. But before he was injured, he was 5 of 5, 16 yards. You know, you could be efficient going 5 of 5, but 16 yards, it's not going to get the job done. And damn sure isn't going to get the job done against Alabama. At home or where, it doesn't matter. Alabama just runs them out of the business, 42-10, as to be expected. Jalen Moreau, I don't want to say he's an anomaly because we've seen his act last year of how he started off slowly, finally got on track and became even more dangerous because we already knew he could run. And then now we saw that his passing game was coming together. I thought he would get an early jump on it this season, even though he does have a new coach. I thought the new coach being Kalen DeBoer, I thought offensively what he had done at NAIA, and then certainly what he had done with Michael Penix, who was just an ordinary quarterback until he was at Washington, a runner-up in the national championship game, a top 10 NFL draft pick with the Atlanta Falcons. This is what DeBoer helped him become. I thought you could do a lot of the same, or he could do a lot of the same with Jalen Moreau. And initially, it didn't start off like that. And last week against South Florida, it didn't look like that. But this time, 5 touchdowns in total because he could still run the ball and be effective. I'm kind of giving up on what you really think of him as an overall quarterback and whatever prognostication I may have for him going into the NFL with round and whatnot. But Jalen Moreau, he's good for college football right now and what Alabama wants to do. And Kalen DeBoer, with the offensive mind that he has, I think he can influence him to become an even better quarterback. And if he does anything of what he had done with Michael Penix last year, who was a running quarterback but turned out to be a pretty darn good passer, it's nothing but a benefit. But Ty Simpson is also in the wings waiting for his opportunity as well. He's been in waiting since last year. He thought he was going to get it. He did get it against South Florida. He and Ty Buckner, who came from Notre Dame, we know the story. He's no longer with the program. He's not even playing football. He's playing lacrosse somewhere else now. But this is what we're talking about. Alabama just being a dominant as usual and taking it on the road. Defense does travel. And Jam Miller, their running back, averaging 7.9 yards a carry. I mean, Ryan Williams, their true freshman wide receiver, just insane. What he's doing as a true freshman, Jeremiah Smith is the other guy who I still think as a true freshman wide receiver is among the best in the country already, and his future looks extremely bright. Let's hope for everything to go according to plan and health is not an issue and that he just lives up to his potential. That's what I'm hoping. But sticking with Alabama's they're going to get their test and they're going to get Georgia in Tuscaloosa. Then we're going to see what's really up. Georgia coming in, trying to get back a seasoned quarterback and Carson Beck, fifth-year quarterback, Heisman Trophy candidate, coming into Tuscaloosa. And we're going to see what is going to happen for real after what happened last year in the SEC championship game. Alabama keeping out Georgia and preventing them from getting the three-peat, which would have been the first three-peat since back in World War II days or even before that, when the Minnesota Gophers pulled it off. So that moves us ahead a little bit in today's college football. FSU, Florida State. I mentioned them a little bit in the beginning, but it goes to mention them again. By the way, I'm going to start putting picks out there for people who might want to put a couple of dollars up for a game, because I've been hitting way too much lately, man, and I haven't been saying it publicly. So there's people out there who may be missing out on a couple of dimes, nickels, and quarters they can get to put and shove into the pillow until Christmas time comes. I'm getting you some Christmas money, so I'm going to start making picks on our usual show. Bias and I, Sports Back Bros podcast, comes Monday and Thursday. I will be leaving picks on Thursday going into the weekend. 4 games, maybe 6 games, so you can pick from. Parlay it out, pick one at a time, but it should be fun. And I bet once I start giving you the picks is when they will start losing, but we'll take that chance. FSU, Memphis, what a mess. FSU is 0-3 now. And as a Miami Hurricane fan, I'm upset about it only because what used to be a great program, even just last season, you saw the mass exodus because of the screwing they had gotten by not getting into the playoff, the 14 playoff, just an undefeated team that was just booted out of the playoff and then got blown out by Georgia. They were the team formerly known as the Seminoles because the same team that started the season was certainly not the team they had when they played Georgia and were absolutely blown away. And I think that was like a death nail for them and their program. And it's always bad when something like that happens. Florida State, a team that's been known to be a great program, and then to come to this, which is nothing, and 20-12, and they struggled to get that 12. And you could point fingers everywhere. It's almost always going to come through the quarterback and the coaching, but in this case, the quarterback is so evident. DJ, I don't even need to mention his last name because we know that is a bad DJ. He was an average DJ at Clemson, never lived up to expectations coming out of high school as a 5-star quarterback out of California, goes to Oregon State. I think I thought a change of scenery may have at least ignited something in him, and that did not happen. And then he goes from Oregon State to Florida State. They really thought they hit the lottery when he came. Now they wish they would have lost the ticket, burned the ticket, or never gotten the ticket because he's doing absolutely nothing but bad things for Florida State. And it's an absolute mess. They have 37 yards rushing. Florida State, 4 sacks against Florida State. This is a school, prideful, of course, but a school where the majority of their players are coming from the state of Florida, which is known for their athletes. And if you heard this show before, this is the second week I'm doing it, so you may not have heard it, but you may have watched this show that I have done with the Sports Back Bros podcast with Bias, and I talked about it ad nauseum. how Florida State, and Miami had about 80% or more of their players from the state of Florida, and they are responsible for 11 national championships over the last 41 years. Say 41 years now because it was 83 when Miami got their first one. So over the last 41 years, 11 national championships between Florida State, and Miami, and the majority of that roster, over 80%, coming from the state of Florida, giving you an idea of if you have Florida players on your team, things will work out. But this is not that Florida team now. This is everybody's coming in scoundering on Florida players, just coming in scavenging, call it what you want. They're just coming in, taking Florida players. They've been doing it for years. But now you have a lot of the other schools that weren't there 30 years ago that are there now, at least playing college football, like Florida Atlantic University, Florida International University. Now, they're not getting top players, but they're taking players that probably could be developed into top players by better coaches. The University of Central Florida, we've seen their act before and how well they had done before when Scott Frost was there, or even when George O'Leary was there at UCF. And then you still have your traditional Miami, Florida State, and then you still have South Florida, who Miami plays next week in a possible trap game in Tampa. They're fairly formidable when they need to be, like they showed last year at home against Alabama. And Alabama did get the get back in Tuscaloosa, but they do show that they can hang and hold the fort at home when they play formidable teams. But anyway, yeah, it's just a different atmosphere for Florida State right now. And it's just bad when teams like that don't win, the way they used to win. And, you could go 6-5 and people would just say, oh, but when you're 0-3, that's a whole new level of bottom dwelling. Bobby Bowden Field, man, this is the guy who fielded it, the guy who built that program, turning over in his grave right now, the great Bobby Bowden. But yeah, that's Florida State for you, giving up 4 sacks and having a bad quarterback. And oh man, it's just a mess, man. I mean, what are you going to do? And then finally, I guess since no one wants to come in and really talk about college football tonight, so I'll go along with it anyway. I wanted to talk about a couple of players who initially I thought about as Heisman Trophy candidates. In the beginning of the season, we saw some of the Heisman Trophy candidates, and of course, Carson Beck was one of those players, the quarterback for the Georgia Bulldogs, because he's playing on perhaps the best team in the country. Typically, when you're the fifth-year starter or fifth-year senior on that team and your second year starting, when you probably should be better than you were in the previous season, you're probably going to get the nod as a Heisman Trophy candidate or an elite Heisman Trophy candidate. We saw Dylan Gabriel coming from Oklahoma, going into the perfect situation in Oregon, as we thought, with Dan Lanning's offense, and seeing what he's doing. It seems like it's kind of taking off right now after what had happened just today with against Oregon State, 500 plus yards of total offense. It looks like it may be churning at the right time. People still have to get used to one another. A fall camp isn't enough. So as you learn on the job, things kind of get a little bit more cohesion and you become more explosive if you're meant to be. But we're talking about the players that have been added to the mix. I talked about Garrett Nussmeier myself as another quarterback who's been thrown in the mix. In fact, Jalen Monroe, another quarterback, was thrown in the mix. And you look at all of these quarterbacks who keep getting the Heisman Trophy, it looks like it's either a running back or a quarterback. Last year, we saw with Jaden Daniels from LSU winning the Heisman Trophy. But this year, I think my top 2 guys who just happen to be running backs, and those top 2 guys, Ashton Jeanty of Boise State, he opened some eyes a couple of weeks ago when he ran for 267 yards. And he did it, I believe, against Georgia Southern. And so when someone does that, you just think, and 6 touchdowns, by the way, he averaged over 13 yards a carry. You think about that and you're like, okay, that's Georgia Southern. Come on. You're putting up nice yards early on in the season against the poor sisters and weak sisters, even though Georgia Southern has a pretty solid program, and Boise State isn't what they once were. So it's more even than you probably would believe. But he ran for 267 yards in that game, 6 touchdowns. And I'm like, wow, I wonder if that's an aberration. Let's wait and see if he could do it against Oregon. Well, he goes against Oregon, and he gets 192 more yards, 3 more touchdowns, 9 on the season, averaging over 7 yards per carry in that Oregon game. In Oregon, Now your eyes are open, saying even though Oregon may be struggling for a third-ranked team, it's still Oregon. Oregon's still a good enough team. And I look at him as being a leading Heisman Trophy candidate. And the reason why I got him as a leading Heisman Trophy candidate, because he's being consistent about what he's doing. And when you watch the film, you could see that explosiveness. There's a difference between him getting his yards and then years ago when I mentioned how Troy Davis for Iowa State got his 2,000 yards, and you saw a little nick here, a little nick there, never really breaking the huge run. Well, he broke some big runs, but he got caught from behind often. GT isn't getting caught from behind. Ashton GT is running that rock, and once he gets that foot on you, he's out. And you could just see that specialness to him, even though running backs have been devalued in the NFL for right now, what he needs to do in college, he's doing it. The Jahmyr Gibbs, who came out of Georgia Tech, went to Alabama, and was able to go in the first round of the draft, along with Bijan Robinson coming out of Texas, going to the Atlanta Falcons. Those kind of players who showed that they're special enough to value as a running back and worth picking early, like Detroit and Atlanta had done for those two players. So I'm thinking that Ashton GT is one of those players, and my other player would be Kyle Managai. Kyle Managai from Rutgers. Not too many people think about Rutgers when you're talking about players at all, let alone running backs. But why wouldn't you think about that as a running back? If you are a diehard college football fan, and I know you will have to be a diehard college football fan to talk about someone from Rutgers with any type of depth outside of Ray Rice, because he seems to be the name that just sticks right there. I'm here to tell you, man, I've been on top of this game for a long time, college football. And I've seen some very good running backs come out of this same Rutgers State University of New Jersey. I've seen players come out of that. Ray Rice wasn't the first of the very good quarterbacks. I mean, I go all the way back to back when Rutgers wasn't that good. They're pretty good now because of what Greg Schiano has built with also Florida players and those Jersey players as well, who are underrated just as well. And in that Northeast area, when he gets players from Pennsylvania, he still gets played from upstate New York, not New York City, but those players are getting better as well. He sneaks out there to Ohio, brings a play in from there. We know about those football playing cities and states. But we look at Craig Mitter, who came out of, I think, Mattawa High School in New Jersey from back in the 90s. I'm talking early 90s. He ended up going to Nassau Community College, which is was a pretty big junior college football program back then. And he played with them and ended up going to Rutgers. Didn't have the career they would have expected, but Rutgers didn't have that supporting cast for him either. And so when you look at a player like that, and then you think about Terrell Willis, another one of those pretty damn dynamic players, if you were to watch him playing for another pretty average, if not below average Rutgers team, he was another one of those names. And then Ray Rice, we talk about him because he is and kind of is the standard bearer. Brian Leonard, I don't think any of you know or remember him. He ended up going to the Bengals. He ended up going to the Bengals, and just the play. Look at the running backs that have come out of it. Pretty consistent running backs. So along with Kyle Managai, who's also a Jersey guy, just like Kansas City Chiefs running back Isaiah Pacheco, a Rutgers guy from Jersey. So that's another one of those Jersey gems that comes out and does well collegiately. And now with Pacheco, probably not superstar, but definitely respectable in the NFL and has 2 rings to show for it, being effective throughout the season and being part of the Super Bowl team, not just being in attendance. And then we also have a couple of other running backs. Jawan Jameson is one that I'll just name right now. If you remember him, he played for Rutgers. I thought he should have stayed, but he came out early. Still was drafted, but didn't cut it, I believe, with the Baltimore Ravens. Now, he's someone I mentioned specifically because I watched him in high school as a rising sophomore. That means he was a freshman rising to sophomore in high school at Bowles here in Jacksonville, where Mac Jones is from. Mac Jones, who's now with the Jacksonville Jaguars, was the first-round draft pick for the New England Patriots. You know the story if you watch football, but he went to that school. I was on the sidelines watching him play as a rising sophomore at the Bowles School, and he was a very good running back in high school, as you would imagine. Goes to Rutgers, starts doing well, leaves early. Hey, who am I to tell him not to? I just would have advised him if he had asked me. But anyways, he still got to the NFL, met his dream, probably got a few paychecks along the way. But anyway, I just thought I needed to mention those things. And that gives me reason to close out this show. I don't know. Tell me what you think or what you thought if you can get through this entire diatribe. If I don't edit and cut this up and make it more consumable in bits and pieces instead of this long, drawn out hour and 10+ minute show that I did. Thank Jermaine for coming in. He came in last week, kind of spewed a few things, give me a few updates on different games. Obviously, there are still games going on right now. Last week, I started at 11 p.m. Today, I start at 8 p.m. because, well, most of the games I thought were worth a damn started earlier. The other games that you kind of expect to kind of go the way it should go started a little later. There are entertaining games, Colorado State. There are some fairly interesting games. Georgia's first true road game against Kentucky. But after Kentucky playing like they did last week, we could just see that. Tennessee also playing. So there's games out there. But I'm Trav, and if you got this far, the Sports Back Bros podcast will be on Mondays and Thursdays, either an edited edition, so we can take out the best of whatever we talked about, the most interesting little tidbit, make it consumable for you instead of the long view, or you could come in and watch the entire thing, however long it lasts. It typically goes about an hour, but thanks for joining me or not joining a pimp tonight. And that's all good because, hey, I like doing this. If I get to talk about damn stuff, I'll do that too. So I'm Trav. The Sports Bad Bros podcast is signing off. This college week 3 view with me comes to an end. So until next week, at least for this kind of information and content, deuces.